Indeed.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Minister of Finance. Is narrowing the wage gap with Australia the fundamental purpose of his government? And if so, where is the specific target in National's 120-point action plan, National's revised 6-point Brighter Future plan, or his more recent 10 results for New Zealanders?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, yes, it is a fundamental purpose of the government, as the Prime Minister has pointed out, and the target has been well articulated. That's why the member's asking us questions about it, and he can monitor it any day of the week. I note that after-tax wages have grown a bit faster in New Zealand than in Australia since we became the government. Well, they have, but we accept that in the light of the commodities boom in Australia, closing that gap is a real challenge, and we aim to do so by 2025.
Supplementary.
The Honourable David Parker.
Has the gap in gross wages on the purchase price parity basis he favours increased from $122 per week in December 2008 to $144 per week in March this year?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, that may be the case. I haven't looked at those numbers in detail. But look, I think the member will understand that we are aiming to close that gap. In the last few years, that's been quite a challenge because Australia has had a once-in-a-100-year commodity boom, and that has pushed their wages up in parts of Australia, and it's difficult to compete with that. But we are pressing on with our plan for a stronger economy, and we believe if we stick to that plan, we can close that gap.
The Honourable David Parker.
Excluding the top 10% of income earners who received approximately 40% of his income tax cuts, has the after-tax wage gap with Australia, as he calculates it, closed or widened for the other 90%?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, the member's representation of the tax package is of course wrong. The impact of the reductions in income tax combined with the increase in GST and significant increases in property taxes means that most New Zealanders were in about the same position after that tax package as they were before. We haven't done, well, that's true. And we haven't done the measurement that the member asked about.
The Honourable David Parker.
Is the Minister willing to calculate whether the after-tax wage gap with Australia for 90% of wage earners in New Zealand is larger now than it was when he took office?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, we can do any calculation that the member likes. The fact is, we're getting on with dealing on planet Earth rather than planet Labour. We're dealing with the real challenges that the New Zealand economy faces, particularly with respect to Australia. And that is to make ourselves more competitive so that our businesses can grow. And that means not following the policies of that government of higher taxes, more debt and less competitive.
Order. You know, the question was actually fairly simple and didn't really need quite that long, especially ending up with, a negative comment about the questioner's party. And the order, I'm on my feet, but the question actually asked, would the Prime Minister of Finance be prepared to calculate the after-tax income gap for the 90% if the top 10% are excluded? And I'm not 100% sure what the answer to the question was. I don't know whether the Minister of Finance is prepared to enlighten the House on that. The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, my answer to the question was you can do any calculation you like, and then went on to elaborate on the main point.
But that wasn't the question. The question didn't ask whether the Minister was prepared to do any calculation. The question asked whether he was prepared to do that calculation. And that's what question time is about. Members ask questions and ministers are meant to answer them. Now, I acknowledge that it's not exactly a huge issue, but it's just it was a simple question, and to avoid it totally is not reasonable. Now, I invite the Minister to answer the question. Does he intend to do that one or not?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Jerry Brown.
Mr Speaker, I just have listened to what you've said, and you've come, I think, very, very close to suggesting that ministers could be required to give yes and no answers. And you'll find in Speaker's rulings a number of references to the fact that that is not a necessary response from ministers, that ministers are the ones who judge what is appropriate for an answer in a question, and that when questions are answered that have a degree of catch-22 to them, ministers have a right to be able to explore that particular possibility in the answers that they give. The assumption that you seem to be making is that any question asked by the opposition is in fact factually based and reasonable, and it may not be.
Order. Now look, the question contained no fact in it at all. It just asked a question. It contained no assertion whatsoever. It just asked whether the Minister of Finance was prepared to do a particular calculation. But there doesn't have to be a reason, and the member shouldn't be interjecting. And what's more, ministers can certainly choose not to answer a question if they invoke the public interest. If they invoke the public interest, they do not need to answer a question. But unless the question is totally unreasonable, I expect an answer. And that's not unreasonable. The standing order requires an answer that seeks to address the question asked must be given, as long as it can be given consistently with the public interest. And this is not the end of the world, and I wouldn't have even raised the matter if the minister hadn't gone on to be critical of the questioner's party. But where ministers choose to be a bit vague in answers, they should then not choose to be critical of the questioner's party. It's a matter of being reasonable and sensible in all of this. And I don't see why it's such a huge issue for the minister to need to avoid that question, because the question was a straight question. If the minister's not avoiding it, the question, if I recollect the question, was very simply, is the minister prepared to calculate the after-tax income gap between Australia and New Zealand, excluding the top 10% of income earners? If it's not been avoided, I'm interested in hearing the answer. The Honourable Bill English.
No.
The Honourable David Parker.
Why should anyone accept his promises on the economy when his government will not even set targets for closing the wage gap or reducing New Zealand's net international liabilities?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, I don't think it is an issue about promises on the economy. It's about applying sensible policy in difficult circumstances to help businesses make the decision to grow. That is, employ another person, invest a bit more money and pay a higher wage. And we will stick to that plan, which is much more constructive than following the policies that member might propose.
Michael Woodhouse.
Thank you. To the Minister, by how much have total after-tax wages grown in New Zealand and Australia since 2008?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, real after-tax wages have increased by 11% in New Zealand since September 2008. By comparison, they've increased 8% in Australia over the same period. So the wage gap has narrowed a bit, but it is a long-term challenge and it is still a significant gap, so there's plenty more work to do. This is a vast improvement on the 9 years to September 2008, when New Zealand's real after-tax wages increased by only 4.4%. That is slightly more than a third of the increase in the last 3 years.
The Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Was he told while he was preparing to answer this question why, after describing narrowing the wage gap with Australia as the fundamental purpose of his government, the Prime Minister was not prepared to defend his record in this House?
I'm not sure that the Minister of Finance is responsible for that question.
Point of order.
Point of order. I'll hear the Honourable Trevor
Mr.
Mallard.
Speaker, questions are often asked of ministers about whether they have specific information or not. My question is, was he informed why? And cutting right to the chase, the Prime Minister wasn't prepared to answer.
No, order. No, if I had any sympathy with the member, I'm afraid he's just blown it now. I'm not, that question's now being ruled out. Question number 7, Simon O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister.
Point of order, I beg your pardon, the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, just in relation to, I think it was question number 2, I was asked a question, I was just looking to take this opportunity seek leave to table the following information. New Zealand government bond rates reached over 20% in May, June and August of 1985, all under a Labour government.
Order.
My favourite was 22%.
Order. The Prime Minister will resume his seat right away. Now order. Now the order. I'm on my feet, and both side front benches will cease this interjection. I'm on my feet. The Right Honourable Prime Minister knows that the practice is to establish the document from the member is seeking leave to table a document, I take it. Order. And the standing orders are very particular. If a member is granted leave to table a document, it must be tabled. And so the House, before I put leave to the House, we need to know the source of the document the Right Honourable Prime Minister was seeking to table.
The data for including the 22%, my favourite, is from the Reserve Bank. I am looking to seek the leave to table the document and not the iPad, though, because I need that back.
Order. I don't think the House is yet clear the document is a Reserve Bank. It's a Reserve Bank document. Order. But if it's just a website, we do not seek leave to table things off websites. Question number 7, Simon O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Tertiary Education, Skills and Employment.